Hi there. I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with ISMG here in ISMG Studio today, where the topic is modern and secure and resilient identity for the AI era. Joining me is Rakesh Shah. He's VP of Product Management and Marketing with Quest. Rakesh, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today.
Thank you for hosting me, Tom.
All right, let's start here. As you know, identity has become the enterprise's most volatile asset. It's the connective tissue of the modern enterprise and also its most targeted weakness today. What would you say is driving this shift, and why is identity risk escalating faster than most any organization can even adapt?
I think fundamentally, identity has become the entry point into any organization, right? Previously, it was really driven by humans who were, getting into organizations via their identity. And now we're seeing this explosion where beyond humans, we're seeing non-humans, whether it's agents or even service accounts is the way to get into that organization. And because of that, that is becoming the way that threat actors are looking at how they can get into an organization. Years ago, it was all about malware, or even going way back to a couple of decades ago, viruses and such. Those are the kind of mechanisms to get into an organization. And with recent advents in AI, we're starting to see that it's easier to use trusted identities, and that's the way to get into an enterprise. And that's really becoming the new control plane beyond what was, in the past.
Well, Rakesh, you make a great point because we have reached a point where non-human identities outnumber human, an estimated 82 to 1. I would say that's a very conservative estimate. But how
Mhm.
does that change the way that CISOs should be thinking about identity as an attack surface?
Yeah, the attack surface is really changing dramatically, right? Non-human identities are attractive to threat actors because they're predictable, and in many cases, they're overprivileged compared to a person, right? There's just this desire to get AI out there. So throwing out an MCP server, turning on AI, the business mandate is there to do it. And these non-human identities are predictable, overprivileged, and also always on. And so when they're compromised, they don't really trigger the same type of alarms that we see when, a human is being used. And so that attack surface has exploded because now we're taking what was human identities and putting that on fire with that, 3x more, maybe, 200x, 300x more number of non-human identities, right? It's just exploding.
What would you say are the biggest blind spots that security leaders have about non-human identity risk?
The biggest blind spots really come around understanding that they are not human identities, right? Non-human identities are significantly different than what you would see in a traditional human, in that, human may have certain behavioral patterns that we're used to, right? For example, back when we used to go in the office, human would come in, they'd log in certain times, they would do certain activities, they would access, certain systems. And it was in many ways, predictable. A lot of the behavioral detection that was out there was looking at when something kind of deviated from those norms of behavior. Well, with agents now replacing some of the activities that humans are doing, right? As I mentioned earlier, they're always on in many cases. When they're always on, they may be, accessing systems, through, some of the instructions the agents are giving that go way beyond what a human would do. So they're accessing more systems. They're doing it. They're always on. They're doing it in very different ways because they're not human, right? And so for CISOs, we built who've built an infrastructure of identity security that assumes that it's a human who's an identity. The huge shift now is that you have to consider it's a non-human, and they're basically not humans. It's a big difference. And I think it's a blind spot that's recognized, but it's one that's going to take some time to kind of illuminate.
Okay, so in an agentic enterprise where so many identities are automated, they're ephemeral, interconnected, how should organizations start to rethink identity governance, lifecycle management, and monitoring?
First, I think getting a true inventory of the identities that are in your enterprise, right? There are a lot of assumptions that, the AI rollouts are relatively controlled. And as a result, there's, kind of an assumption that they understand the identities that are out in their enterprise. And the reality is that because there has been this business push to get AI out there as quickly as possible, what's happening is there's a lot of shadow AI being deployed. So I think the number one thing to do is first get an accurate inventory of all the agents that are running in your organization. And you can't just assume it's the AI technologies that you've approved, right? You may say, hey, we are standardized on Microsoft Copilot, but I bet you there's a lot of Claude and OpenAI agents also running in your enterprise. So understanding, all of the identities, the agent and the agent ones first, going to really deeply kind of get that inventory is the first step. The second step is really then understanding the vulnerabilities and the risk associated with those identities. In so many cases, those identities actually have more privileges than humans, right? We have a whole kind of governance infrastructure that's built for understanding how a human is going to be managed in that identity lifecycle. We don't have that yet for AI. It's coming, right? So I think then first, after you've understood kind of what your identities are, second, you want to understand the risk associated with those identities, and then figure out how you monitor that over time and manage that. And so it's a different world, but it's one that I think over time we'll be able to wrap our arms around.
Well, Rakesh, that's great context for us to talk about the future of identity security. So, if you were to
Mhm.
look ahead 12 to 18 months, or even 12 to 18 weeks, what are some of the emerging identity trends that CISOs need to be preparing for today?
Yeah, I think the next 12, 18 months are going to reward the organizations that treat identity like critical infrastructure first and foremost, continuously defending it, continuously observing it. And the last part, which is less common, continuously recovering it. What I mean by that is that the assumption is that identity is going to fail, right? When identity fails, the business fails. Operations come to a standstill, right? Your employees can't get to the applications that they need to get to. The business effectively grinds to a halt. So really the question becomes, how quickly can you recover? Can you recover in minutes, or do you have to recover in days? Getting beyond keeping the attackers at the gate to assuming the attackers are going to get in. When they get in, what can you do to basically get them out and to bring your business, if you will, back online?
Rakesh, as AI becomes embedded in every workflow, what new identity challenges beyond the non human identities do you expect to surface that organizations aren't planning for yet?
The idea that CISOs really don't consider kind of one platform that kind of pulls all of that together into one. And what I mean by that is that there's going to be challenges where you're going to have an incident. That incident is because an identity was compromised, that then led to privilege escalation, that then led to maybe a data breach, right? So, we're going to see that happen. In fact, AI is going to accelerate that. But when that happens, you need that ability to detect it, respond, and recover very quickly. And for us, we're very much looking at it from kind of the identity infrastructure. And there's so many customers who are doing it for, hybrid active directory and Entra ID, especially. And that idea that when you've done the recovery, you've learned from that. And now you can put that back into how you're going to protect the enterprise and detect and stop the next incident, right? So I think that, one big thing to consider is, it's all going to be one where you learn from what you see out there, right? So having kind of one solution that can help you, or just one methodology that can help you really kind of go from understanding to then fortifying how you do it in the future. I think that's really key.
So, Rakesh, if you're advising a C suite team today, and hey, in this platform you are, what are the top identity related decisions they need to get right in this next year?
The number one thing that a security organization needs to look at is really, again, getting a handle on the identities that are in their infrastructure, starting with not just kind of the identities that you think you would have, like through the cloud-based applications, but also looking at things like Active Directory and understanding what some of those kind of on-prem legacy ones that you have. So understanding that, both from a human and non-human perspective. I've talked a lot about non-human, but you still have to kind of get the basics down and really understand your identities that are there. From there, everything else will follow, right? Understanding the risk associated with them. What's the vulnerabilities? How do you remediate those vulnerabilities? And then how do you monitor those identities to make sure that a threat actor hasn't taken advantage of that trusted identity that you verified, that has the access to the systems, again, human, non-human identities, and then leverage in a way to cause effectively damage to the enterprise, whether it's a data breach, a ransomware incident. Those are the things you have to look for. But it all starts with true visibility and understanding the risk associated with that.
Well, speaking of risk, how do you recommend that leaders balance innovation, modernization, AI adoption with this rising complexity of identity risk? It's not one they can back down from.
The challenge is daunting, right? The business is under pressure to get non-human identities, agents out there as quickly as possible, right? That's part of the promise of AI. We live in a world where now the expectation is that we're hiring, if you look at AI agents, thousands of employees now, right? Effectively, an AI agent is an employee, right? And here's the difference, right? Unlike those 1,000 interns you might hire or employees who work 40 hours a week, they're going to be 24/7. They're going to have ways of accessing things that you've never kind of even imagined that they could access, right? So focusing on that and understanding that, the world has changed. And then how do you think through what the impact of that is going to be on your security practice? What are your, and it's more than just, understanding the interesting technology out there. It's just the fundamentals as an enterprise, right? What are your operational procedures? What are you doing to, measure risk in your organization? All the fundamental things that when you're a security organization, you've done, but now you're doing it in a world where it's been fueled by AI adoption, right? And so I don't think it changes the fundamentals, right? As a security organization, you have to be outcome driven. As you're outcome driven, you're going to have ways you're going to do that. And I think AI is just going to have to now be considered because of just the sheer amount of AI adoption. And as I mentioned, you're living in a world now where you're going to be hiring 1,000 employees, but 1,000 agents who work 24/7 and who are always going to be on. So it's going to force you to rethink just the fundamentals of security, but the fundamentals of security don't change. It's just now you're going to have to adopt it to work in this new world where you're bringing on all these agents and non-human identities.
So, if you were to summarize the identity mandate for modern enterprise in one single message to the C suite, what would it be?
Treat identity as maybe your most critical infrastructure. Continuously understand it, continuously defend it. And again, the last part, which is, I truly believe, is continually have resilience in it. Because when identity fails, the business is going to fail, period.
That really is the message, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rakesh, is there a mindset shift that has to occur that will separate organizations that thrive in the AI era from those that fall behind?
I think the business mandate to roll out AI is just so significant right now, right? The business pressure to roll out AI is so significant right now that enterprises that are able to kind of adapt their security practices, their operational procedures, their security basics to accommodate that in many ways, probably, too aggressively being rolled out AI are the ones that are going to be able to succeed, right? There's no way that security can slow down progress, right? As much as, I think we in the security industry, want businesses to do the right thing, and I can think of examples of even in our organization where they're like, here are the security policies, here's how we treat AI. And then in many ways, shadow AI rules, right? And that's because there's just so much pressure on the organization and employees to find ways to use AI to do their jobs and to do them more effectively. And frankly, that business pressure is not going anywhere. So for organizations to be successful in the future, they have to recognize that that's happening and build their infrastructure and their security practice to really accommodate that. In the end, right, it's all about doing what security has done for years, enable the business, but you're enabling the business in a way that's different. And I think that's, it's a different world. I think some of it is we're going to feel around in the dark as we figure out where the world takes us. And in some cases, maybe, the promises of AI won't be there as much as people thought there were. And so some of that may get modulated over time. But I don't think security organizations can be the office of no. Security organizations are going to have to be the office of yes, so that because the business pressure, the mandate is there, and there's really no way getting around that. And the ones that can figure out how to enable it are the ones that are going to succeed.
No, well said. Rakesh, I'm thinking about financial services, healthcare, critical infrastructure. As you know, these sectors face intense regulatory scrutiny, operational risk. What identity challenges are most unique, or perhaps I should say most urgent for these sectors?
The regulated industries, such as healthcare and financials, are the ones that really have to pay attention to the kind of security basics, if you will. They are also in many cases the ones that are rolling out AI, right? Like the financial services being very innovative in terms of what they're trying to do with AI. Even healthcare, we're seeing some incredible advances where AI is getting rolled out. So the business pressure is going to be there. The difference between a non-regulated industry and a regulated industry is that the regulated industry also has to answer to the regulators, right? And the regulators do, in many ways, put a pause or slow down some of these initiatives, right? Because as a regulated industry, you have to effectively, keep up with your compliance standards and not violate those regulations, right? So unlike an enterprise that's non-regulated, right, where they may be able to move faster and have less of those roadblocks or friction that is introduced, a regulated industry is absolutely going to have that friction, as it should, right? And the answer is really around, again, trying to figure out, going back to security basics, the fundamentals. How do you enable the business while keeping up with the compliance standards that are out there, making sure that you're doing everything that the regulators expect you to do? Really, the worst thing to do is, you open that up completely. Of course, that business pressure is going to be there to roll out AI and AI agents. You have not built out that infrastructure to understand the AI, what the impact of it is. You haven't done the monitoring, you haven't done the defending, and then there's a business issue or there's a security incident, and you don't have all the basics set for that. So as a regulated company, you really have to have those basics down. You have to do things around continuously governing identities, defending it, being able to recover when there's an incident. And in some cases, when you're in a regulated industry, you know, if you've made a mistake there, regulators may step in. So it's more than just financial and brand damage, right? You may have regulators step in. So that's why I do think that the ability to recover your business, have resiliency in the business is especially key in those regulated industries.
Rakesh, last question for me. How can leaders in these industries build identity strategies that support both security and the necessary operational velocity?
I think the challenge is especially going to be there for regulated industries as they're trying to find that balance, as they want to enable the business to leverage AI, and they also want to be able to meet the regulations that are out there as a regulated company. And so for them, I think it again comes down to business and security fundamentals. And what I mean by that is, understanding that you understand your security outcomes. Do you have the right operational procedures? Have you built a resilient business? And so I think the fundamentals are even more important there, because in the end, the fundamentals, if you get them right, if you have the infrastructure, if you have the operational procedures, if you have the resilience, in many ways, you can then enable the business to use these new amazing technologies to get AI out there. But I think if you don't have those fundamentals, you're actually going to do yourself a disservice and slow things down. So I think you start with the basics, implement those. From there, understand your security outcomes that you're really focused on, and then let AI, in many cases, flourish. And then there's also AI helping you define those security outcomes and helping you, do the defense and helping you build, that infrastructure, right? So in many cases, AI is the enabler for the business. It's also the enabler for security organizations.
Rakesh, well said. I appreciate your time and insights today. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you, Tom.
Again, the topic has been modern, secure, and resilient identity. You've just heard from Rakesh Shah with Quest. For ISMG, I'm Tom Field. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your attention today.